Thanks very much. When Nadia's office contacted me, I don't know, a year and a half ago, I thought finally I can stop worrying about food waste. The FAO and other institutions have been looking at various different impacts and costs and opportunities, but the one really missing gap was measuring the overall environmental impacts of food waste. And I'd done some, well, not quite back of the envelope, but not much more than that, calculations of the sort that Nadia has now really fleshed out. But there are a couple of things I'm going to move on to, and I'm actually going to skip over these first three slides, and start with the question, what's the difference between $20 and $6,500? It might seem self-evident to you, but in true cost accounting, the difference is, as Nadia has just pointed out, the difference is how and whether you include the impacts of land use and land use change in your production of food. Now, Patrick has asked me to talk about food waste, and I am going to talk about food waste, but what I'm going to say applies equally to many of the other things that we do. Think of a third of the world's food being wasted. That's a third of the cultivable land of the planet being cultivated for no good purpose. You could think about something similar in respect of, roughly a third of the arable land, or a bit more than that, being used to grow crops to feed livestock that were not really domesticated in the first place to use those crops. So it extends outwards. But coming back to food waste, it is the archetypal externality. It is by definition the externality. It is the stuff that we emit from the system. And there have been lots of efforts throughout the last 100 years or so to try to internalize those costs, if you like. The most obvious ones are taxing waste. I hope I'm not being parochial by thinking of the EU landfill directive, which was precisely about trying to internalize the cost of disposing of waste within the system, so you have to pay to send stuff to landfill. But the problem with these taxes, and in particular the EU landfill tax, but it applies anywhere, is that it completely misses the point of the main impacts of wasting stuff like food. EU landfill tax and the policies that have been adopted by nation states to implement their obligations under that tax have focused entirely on just lifting stuff out of landfill and sending it one step up the hierarchy to composting or anaerobic digestion. Of course, vastly more resource efficiency can be gained by not wasting that stuff in the first place. And that's where there's been a bit of a policy vacuum. And in particular, it's the impacts on land use and land use change that the reduction of food waste has the biggest benefits. And just to point in with some really big figures at the difference that we're talking about. Nadia has just pointed out that according to her calculations, between $55 and $315 billion is the value of the carbon emissions resulting from the production and processing of wasted food. I want us to think about that third of the cultivable land of the planet. Let's imagine we didn't grow food on it, because we're wasting it anyway. So let's stop food waste and leave it for a moment. This is not a plan, but this is a hypothetical. This is to bring to our attention one of the things that I think we're missing out on when we talk about the impacts, and particularly in true cost accounting. Let's imagine we leave that land and trees start growing on it. We select which bits we're going to leave. If we did that, the quantity of carbon sequestered thereby would be 26 billion tons a year. That's a value of $2,210 billion, according to Stern's valuation of carbon emissions, which is controversial, but this is just an indication. So 2,210, it increases if you include that opportunity cost of using land, it increases the impact of not wasting or not using land in the first place. I hope I'm making myself clear. And I'm going to try and illustrate just what that means in terms of actual implementable policies. I'm very interested in what we do with food waste that isn't fit for human consumption, and I think the next best option, and in fact it's not very controversial to say it, is to feed it to pigs. Now, this chart shows you how the carbon emissions that can be saved if you feed a ton of food waste on the first hand to an anaerobic digester to produce methane, thereby displacing conventional energy production because you can burn the methane and produce renewable energy. So per ton of food waste, you can see how much carbon we save per ton of food waste by doing that. If you compare that to feeding the same ton of food waste to pigs, you save roughly 60% more. And by the way, I'm being quite generous to AD here because I'm including some use of waste hot water, which many AD plants don't do. So you can see already it's vastly better, or significantly better, you could say. But I have not included, as many life cycle analyses and some true cost accounting efforts do not, I have not included in these figures the impacts of land use change. If you do include the impacts of land use change, it's a different picture. What this chart assumes is that to grow the pig feed that you feed your pigs, which you can displace by using food waste instead, you don't have to import 40 million tons of soy meal to Europe every year, because you're using your food waste, which at the moment is an environmental liability and instead can be used as a resource. So you displace the use of and the need for soy meal, and thereby you avoid the demand for soy meal, which is driving, as we all know, deforestation, the ploughing up of the Cerrado, soil erosion, and all of the other impacts associated with soy production in South America. Now, according to these figures, what I've done is actually divide the impact of that by 20, according to past 2050 stipulations that I should allow for 20 years of soy cultivation on any individual piece of land. So in fact, if you didn't do that, it would be 20 times bigger than that. And just to give you an idea of this in monetary terms, so AD saves you $12 of carbon emissions. Feeding it to pigs, without including land, saves you $20, the $20 I started with. Feeding it to pigs and including the impacts of land use change and dividing that by 20 saves you $328. But I would argue, although it's not necessary to, because it's already very clear that you should be feeding it to pigs, not an AD plant if you possibly can, that you shouldn't be dividing it by 20. And that, if you don't, saves you $6,573 carbon emissions. Why do I think we should be thinking about deforestation? We've had some excellent presentations in the last few days in the workshops about the difference. For example, Adrian has told us about the difference between the costs of conventional versus best practice coffee production. We know about best practice meat production and worst practice meat production, and we can compare those two. But I think what we have to keep in mind is, what is the difference between demanding this kilo of whether it's coffee or meat or soy meal and not demanding it at all? Because not demanding it at all is surely the biggest gain of all. And therefore, both, I think, from an individual perspective when we go and buy and think about the process of production, but more importantly, when we think about national and even more important international policies. For example, the EU ban on using food waste to feed pigs. You'll get where I'm driving at here. Is what we have to bear in mind is any additional demand for food of any type, more or less, anywhere in the world, requires a corollary expansion of the agricultural frontier, which is happening at the expense of forests and grasslands. And that is the single biggest impact that we are having on our planet right now. It's the single biggest impact we've had historically. And any measurement of the impact of food waste, and food demand should, I think, assume to some extent that we're increasing the demand for deforestation. I hope you'll allow me one more minute. We've had a little bit about what are the mechanisms available for actually making some of these true costs reflected in what is actually paid for. I've talked about waste tax being an effort towards that. We've had some other mechanisms. The British Parliament passed a law called the Groceries Code Adjudicator Bill, one of the primary objectives of which is to cause retailers to incur part of the cost of the waste that they cause their suppliers to produce. So they are obliged now to share the cost of waste that they cause their suppliers. They used to be able to offload it, and that was unfair. And the Competition Commission said that's unfair, and the code says you're not allowed to do that, you've got to share it. So that's an attempt to internalize the cost into the business that is causing that waste. There are others, like tax rebates for food donated, which you see in France and America, thereby internalizing the social benefits of donating food rather than destroying it. But the internalization process that my organization, Feeding the 5,000, focuses on is internalizing the cost of waste into the reputation of businesses, namely damaging the reputation, the brand image of a supermarket or another company that is particularly bad at food waste. And it is on brand image that these companies are currently competing. Damage their brand or enhance their brand through exposure of malpractice. That is the way we have available to us right now to internalize the costs of waste and the costs of environmental damage. And not just to businesses, but to society as a whole. To internalize the impacts in our consciences by connecting us with the impacts of our food choices. That, I believe, is the immediate opportunity for true cost accounting, and indeed allows us not just to put a numerical value, but to value things that are in fact invaluable: forests, species, planets.
Brilliant.